Welcome back everybody to Interstellar Quests. We have arrived at episode number 5, in which we will return to Minmus. And we have a special spacecraft for you. So kicking it off on the launch pad is Diet Sagan B4M. M of course standing for the Minmus mission, but the combination of a Sagan and a Diet spacecraft on the same rocket is something new. And it requires quite a bit of lifting power, so we are leveraging every bit we can press out of or squeeze out of our Vulcan rocket. So we're using the Vulcan Heavy, and I don't think you've seen this one before. Basically it's a normal Vulcan with 2 additional boosters, and it can carry the entire stack. This is the equivalent of a Saturn V, but the Saturn V could push 120 metric tons to orbit, and this is something like 12. On board we have Brooke and Dandemone. Dandemone is the resident scientist, and she's flying around and she's making sure all the instruments perform correctly, gather all the signs on the long trip over to Minmus. Well, long trip, I think it's about 4 or 5 days to get there, which is relatively short compared to the moon in the Apollo program or in the Artemis program, or I'm not sure what the Chinese program is called, but it's going to take you a little bit longer. But that is a weird thing to happen. So something is happening to our lander. Something is clipping in the tank, which can be restored by the power of time warping. And a mission control decides, well, that's probably just a glitch. Why would we abort a mission on something like that? So the team has boarded the lander. Brooke and Dandemone decide to land anyway. My reasoning was that I saw the error in the descent stage. Something was clipping into the descent stage in the tank, and Minmus has a low gravity moon, so you could probably do this on the ascent stage only. This thing has been designed for the moon, and the ascent stage only has something like 600 meters per second, so that will be fine. I'm sure they'll be fine. You see them banking away, which is a smart thing because our lower stage is bouncing off the planet. Again, we descended mostly on the transfer stage to make sure that we would utilize our descent stage as little as possible, because there's something going on. You can see we are missing a fuel tank over there. Regardless, she is leaving and gathering all the juicy science, including the golf experiment, of course, which brings on quite a bit of science, actually. And here she is inspecting the landing legs and making footprints on Minmus. She's quite the occasion. And over here, we notice we're missing a tank, and I think we're also missing the goo container or the materials container on there. Brooke is also leaving the spacecraft, ready to stretch her legs and figure out what to do. She's deploying the science equipment. Yes, I figured out how to do that. There's a separate button for that. But then I forgot to bring a solar panel, so this is kind of a useless experiment. As an intermezzo, the KSP decides to launch Scout C5. This had to happen because of the window to Eve, launching on a regular Calypso B. And the stock alarm clock told me it was time to leave for Eve. So I built a spacecraft and we're launching it in orbit, only to find out that Eve is completely in the wrong position. So either I don't know how this works, or both trajectories and MacJeb are disagreeing with the stock implementation of transfer windows. I'm going to leave the craft up here for 255 days and hope the technology is not ancient by the time we reach that time frame. But yeah, she just has to wait, because I just can't figure out a efficient trajectory earlier than say in a year. So let's go back to Minmus then. And back on Minmus, we have Brooke planting the flag and trying to get on the lander, but since she's the pilot, there is no stabilization in the lander, and she manages to flip the entire lander around. And of course she's pushing it back up, but lacks the dexterity, shall we say so. But then I thought, hey, there's tons of RCS and control wheels on the lander, so fortunately we're on Minmus. They've completed all their science in this icy basin, and they figured out, hey, there is another spot we could go to, which is very nearby. On Minmus, science hops will take you maybe 30 meters per second to jump into a different biome, which is what we're going to do. And we're going to use the biome map that we created earlier to figure out where to go. We're going to the lowlands, and there was another ridge nearby, but I decided that 2 biomes is enough for one mission. But we can see them here descend very slowly and touch down on the surface of Minmus. Yeah, so second opportunity to get loads of science. And I did delete some of the footage. You can hear the beeping of science now, which is really annoying. But it's a handy tool to remind you that there's science to be gathered, because otherwise you might forget it. Yeah. Back into the lander. And you can see also this little canister in the bottom. That is what I use to store all my experiments. And then the scientists will try to transfer them into the main capsule. And what she can't transfer will be transmitted from the lander before we crash it back into Minmus. Getting up on the descent stage, easy. Again, plenty of delta V. I think you need only 200 meters per second to get off Minmus. And to get off the moon, you need something like 580. Better practice 600 just to be safe. But we're catching up with our main spacecraft. I'm making relatively short excursions, which means that the inclination of the spacecraft flying overhead hasn't changed that much. Mostly that's done 1 or 2 orbits. And this will change in the future when we do longer excursions. And you can imagine that when you are in an inclined plane compared to where you've landed, and the moon starts to rotate, because moons rotate, the spacecraft is no longer directly overhead. But if you stay a short period of time and also remember the orientation of your docking ports, that's also helpful. But if you stay a relative short amount of time, the spacecraft will be directly overhead and it will be easy to rendezvous. Well, relatively easy. Brooke and Dandemone have returned into their main Calypso spacecraft and now preparing to go home. Of course, they have to orient the solar panels manually. We haven't really figured out tracking technology yet. But we have figured out how to switch on both engines, which is better than the Mun mission. So we're able to get back quite easily. We do struggle yet again with the approach angle as we did last time. And I also I talked about this last episode, that if you go relatively low into your periapsis, you dip deep into the atmosphere, you will land in one go, but you will also put a lot of stress, like heat stress, on the spacecraft. And of course you can mitigate that. You could add heat shields and loads of stuff. But you could also go a little bit higher, make a multipass re-entry, and that way save a little bit on weight and technology. I am looking at these heating bars with quite some anxiety. Things did blow up, but not on this spacecraft, on the transfer stage and on the docking ports. Those blowed up, but you can see it's holding together, but barely. So we really need something bigger, because if you have a bigger surface, it will break easier and dissipate the heat easier. So I think that's something we need to design quite quickly. But before we move into that, I want to pay homage to Scott Manley, because he mentioned the airport or the aircraft team, and he was very fond of building airplanes, and I never was very good in it. So as a nod to Calvin McCloy, I picked some of his design ideas. He has an excellent video, which if I remember I will link into the description, on how to build planes in KSP. And he goes into complete detail on how airplane wings actually work, which was super helpful. But here you can see me, Jeb, breaking the sound barrier in his fighter/recon jet, climbing to an altitude about 15 kilometers. And I mainly wanted to get back into landing. So how does landing work? How do we make a plane land properly, make the turn. What is the ceiling of these whiplash engines? How high can I actually go? And I also found that I couldn't launch from the island runway because I hadn't discovered it yet. So here's me making the landing attempt, trying to figure out if I can actually land an aircraft, but also discovering the island runway. And I hadn't forgotten how wobbly it is, so I will use Kerbal Constructs to build a proper base here, and that will be the home for the airport team. Which brings us to the launch of the first Hermes class spacecraft. So it's a very small spacecraft designed by Well, forum user Well. It's from the CNES mod, and in homage to him, I've called this spacecraft L'Esprit, or Spirit. Well, it has multiple meanings, but in this case I think Spirit would be the best translation. And on board we have, let me check my notes, Jeb and Taemin. And there's our first spaceplane. Getting into orbit quite easily. I had expected it to struggle a little bit, so apparently the Vulcan Heavy can lift a lot more than just 10 tons, because this spacecraft is 12 tons. It also carries a 400 kilogram payload, which is the Scansat A1. I unlocked a new resource scanner, which I want to bring to the MUN and see if I can get more detailed biome and resource maps. So I thought, why not combine these two missions? And if we put them in a particular orbit, we also satisfy yet another contract. Yeah, so here's Jeb doing the final approach to Skylab 1 and docking to the only node that they have available, which unfortunately has its docking port on a weird angle. So I need to fix that. I need to figure out how to attach stuff in EVA and then also rotate them properly. But you can get a little tour of the spaceplane going into the dock at the end. We find that we also have 500 kilogram of crystals, which we shall be returning back to Kerbin. As you may recall, the first laboratory brought online is a crystal experiment laboratory. I think we did similar things on Skylab. The Soviets definitely had an entire module on Mir space station called Crystal, hence crystals, to grow crystals in space and return them, maybe not for profit but for science. However, we do it for profit, and we net for about 50k, which is not that much, so I may not go through all the hassle of repeating that. Scansat A1 with a magnetometer, a new visual observation instrument, and a new resource scanner and a radar scanner has entered orbit around the MUN and will start doing its juicy science, updating our maps. And we're still trying to figure out where to put down a base. We're gonna need some serious resources to develop fuel, but also rocket parts. I'm trying to figure out if I can find helium-3, because I know that's going to be a resource I'm going to need somewhere in the future. But for now, we can see that Jap is deconnecting. Mirlong is the other astronaut. And they're trying to descend back into the atmosphere under I think this is like 70-80 degree angle. The original space shuttle would do it on a 40 degree angle. But I had to use QuickSight quite a few times because I overshot completely. I even overshot the island runway. So here's me trying to figure out what the proper angle of attack is. Initially, I had picked a landing site about 100 kilometers after KSC, thinking that I would bleed off the additional speed. But that turned to be an error in thinking. I think for now, I'm going to put the descent point exactly on the KC and then use either gliding or lifting to get to the right spot. Here is us breaking the sound barrier. And I was also trying to figure out what is the minimum speed of this airplane, because I didn't really check that, and I even have to use the last of the monopropellant to get a little bit higher and get closer to the main airport. And now, here is us in final approach, picking up a bit of speed because we're starting to stall. I need 120, 130 meters per second to keep this plane in the air, or it will fall like a brick, and there's no recovering once the nose starts dipping. Yeah, you can hear the sound effects kicking in. However, you want to land with roughly 80 meters per second, so this is very careful timing. I struggle a bit with the nose, so RCS, fortunately I have enough monopropellant to both give us a small kick in speed as well as maintaining attitude. Lining up with the runway was never my strongest feat, but we're almost there. We're just a little bit too fast and too high. This is where I realized we're going to overshoot. And I also realized that one of my Kerbal Constructs taxiways is a little bit too high. So I'll have to go into the editor and fix that. But in a large ditch attempt, Jeb pulls the plane around, levels up with the meadow that's just beside the runway, and sticks the landing, which is a feat in itself. First space plane landing that did not fall apart. Calling it a success.